Hello, this is Matt Caddo. I'm making this video just as we prepare to leave Indonesia for the long trip back to the United States. But I wanted to share with all of you some of the important information that we gathered while we were on this trip. Obviously, Indonesia is critically important to maintaining a supply of pure, contaminant-free kratom raw materials. One of the biggest problems we have is that the FDA gets in the way of that by its import alert, which creates a black market supply channel where there is no testing, there's no validation of the quality of the material that's coming into the United States. That's a problem the FDA creates, and the people in Indonesia are simply trying to find a way in order to economically benefit from this wonderful plant that provides benefits to so many. We obviously have to stop the push here in Indonesia by the BNN, which is the equivalent to our DEA in the government, who have been promoting a ban on the exportation of kratom and a ban on kratom itself in Indonesia, which would have onerous impacts both on the economy and on the climate in this region. And thirdly, we wanted to seek the cooperation of the Indonesian government to hold the US FDA accountable to properly regulate kratom, to allow for a commodity-based trading channel where all parties could be protected in terms of the economics of any kind of product exportation. The Indonesian farmers and processors are making enormous progress. When I first came to Indonesia 4 years ago, I saw situations where the farmers didn't understand how important it was that they harvest and dry the kratom leaves under sanitary conditions. They had to understand that they couldn't use World War II era coffee grinding machines to grind the kratom leaves into crumbs so that they could send it to processors to be made into powder. The processors themselves didn't know that how important it was to use food grade powder machines in order to comply with FDA regulations for food products. And many of them didn't know the procedures that needed to be followed that were required by the FDA for any food product. And finally, they had to understand that testing of the raw materials, both for contaminants and for non-kratom material, and for the quality of the metrogenine content of the powder itself, those things have changed dramatically. It is not perfect, and not everyone is following this, but the progress that we've seen in this 4 years is magnificent. It is now possible for kratom raw materials coming out of Indonesia to be compliant with FDA regulations for food products. And we know that continued progress is on the horizon here if the FDA would cooperate and if they would truly protect the American public by implementing regulations rather than an onerous import alert. We had the opportunity, and it was an amazing opportunity when you view this in context, to meet with the Minister of Health for the country of Indonesia, equivalent to meeting with the HHS secretary in the United States. What he told us was that the Ministry of Health has concluded their own internal scientific research and evaluated what the proper categories or classification of kratom is. They have decided that kratom is a medicinal herb. That's important, critically important, because it means that the BNN is not going to be able to prevail in their effort to ban kratom in 2024. The BNN would have to make a scientific case in order to justify their position rather than relying upon the FDA for all of their information. And I'll talk about that in just a second. The Ministry of Health also agreed that they wanted to support more cooperative research. They ask us to share the information that's available in the United States that's peer-reviewed published literature on kratom. I'm talking about the good quality research, not the case reports that you will occasionally see from doctors who are treating patients who do not use rigorous scientific standards to evaluate what the proper research is needed, and that would be accepted, by the way, by the FDA. We think that's a good standard, and that we'll continue to support the Ministry of Health as they pursue that. We then, secondly, had a meeting with the Minister of Trade, which is the equivalent of meeting with our Commerce Secretary. And he told us that he fully supports kratom exportation, that he is willing to go and work with the FDA in order to secure a supply chain of kratom raw materials, and will help in removing or modifying the current import alert on kratom products. But he told us the most important thing is that the the chief of staff or the president's office, similar equivalent to the White House, would have to authorize and approve their work in this area. Chief of Staff Muldoko, to the president of this country, convened a forum on kratom, and we were invited to participate and make a presentation on the current status of science and the current regulatory policy here in the United States. What came from that meeting is that he stated that the government supports the position of the Minister of Health that kratom is properly classified as a medicinal herb, that the BNN will have to cooperate with a scientific research that is internally done in the country of Indonesia. The BNN responded saying, and they repeated every single one of the talking points that the FDA puts out. But General Muldoko cut them off and said, we will follow Indonesian science and we will follow good science. And he sought to cooperate both with the American Kratom Association and with the internal research arm of the government, now called BRIN, B-R-I-N, who had clarified that they too had agreed with the Minister of Health on terms of the research that's being done. Secondly, Chief of Staff Muldoko agreed to work with us to seek modifications to the current import alert, which would have dramatic impacts on the quality of the raw material that would come out of Indonesia. It will eliminate the gray or the black market for kratom raw material supplies. And he agreed to help in implementing standards for kratom harvesting and processing and requiring final testing prior to leaving the country to assure that these products are not contaminants. It is not to suggest that the farmers in Indonesia are trying to deliberately sell contaminated products. They don't know or have not in the past used good regulatory processes in order to secure the supply chain of kratom raw materials. And as I mentioned, the resources are now available for them to actually participate in that process to make sure that we have pure, safe kratom raw material coming out of Indonesia. Finally, we met with the governor of West Kalimantan, who convened a conference. And in that conference, there were 150 kratom farmers from the remote regions of Indonesia where kratom grows ubiquitously, who drove more than 18 hours on buses to come and participate in this conference. It was amazing to see their commitment, amazing to see these humble people who are working in order to make a living, seeking to find ways that they can most effectively sell their products. The governor made it clear that he supports this effort to keep this kratom supply channel open and available. He supports the policy of making sure that the kratom raw materials are tested, that they're quality materials. We know the challenges. There is, because the FDA imposes the import alert and because the FDA will not participate in the actual standards by which the Indonesian government could assure that these raw materials are being sent that are safe and contaminant free and properly tested. It is the FDA's error in doing this, and it gets in the way of the Indonesian government being able to do exactly what needs to be done. We have today a black market of kratom raw materials just because of the classification of the FDA using an import alert authority to say that kratom is banned in the United States. That is a bad policy and needs to be corrected by the US Congress, and we're going to continue to work in that area. But what is happening is that these farmers are finding willing American consumers who will bypass the procedures that are in place right now to make sure that kratom is properly harvested, that it's quality kratom material that's coming out, not blended and mixed in with other botanical material that's non-kratom in order to produce volume and thereby increase the amount of money that the farmers are able to make because it's not pure kratom. They're finding willing customers in the United States, and there has to be a recognition that the reality of the marketplace is that if we want the FDA to properly regulate kratom, we've got to agree to accept those regulations to make sure that these raw materials are pure, contaminant-free. It will assure the safety of these products. It's cheaper, no question, if the farmers can sell it directly through FedEx or UPS to a willing customer, and the farmers will say, oh, yes, it's being tested, it's being properly manufactured. I've seen it firsthand. Not true unless they subject themselves, those farmers subject themselves to the standards that are now being implemented and available to them if they choose to do so. So we are, in some cases, as American consumers, equally responsible when you see someone bypassing that system. We've got to stop the disinformation that is going to farmers from our own community. We have people in the kratom community today who are misleading these farmers about how awful these American vendors are that are selling their products at higher prices than what they're being paid in Indonesia for the raw material. It is a nature of a supply chain of raw materials that a vendor will achieve value for their products by processing them, by manufacturing them, packaging them, and marketing them. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can't be abused, but there's certainly not the argument that is currently being made by some of the people in the American kratom community that is giving disinformation to farmers, sowing discontent, all for a buck. And trust me, that's the bottom line. They simply want to make money on the backs of these poor farmers by claiming that somehow the American kratom industry is corrupt. They say it's equally true about the AKA. We're not perfect, but we're certainly not we're not the organization that is characterized by some of these interveners that should be silenced by one thing, and that is that the American consuming public of kratom simply ignores them, doesn't give them the oxygen that they can make these ridiculous claims. And finally, we've got to stop the disinformation in the kratom community in the United States. There will be disagreements about the level of the kinds of regulations that in the real marketplace, if the FDA were truly doing their job so that the supply chain of kratom was protected, then we would have to be subjected to the FDA regulations. There are some people that say this is a plant that nature grows and therefore we should be able to sell it. They take that libertarian view. It is a misguided view. The reality is we want the FDA to regulate it. Make no mistake, the FDA's current position on kratom is wrong. The bias that is embedded in the FDA against kratom and other similar botanical products is a bad policy. Make no mistake that the FDA is completely disseminating inaccurate information about kratom, but those problems are fixed. Those challenges are met when we use the system that we have available to us with the US Congress in the same way that the FDA was told that they could not promote the anti-dietary supplement program that they were on, which was the playbook they're using for kratom today. When the Congress in 1994 established the Dietary Supplement to Health and Education Act, which limited the FDA's ability to overregulate and improperly ban dietary supplements, an industry today that's worth more than $100 billion, an industry that allows consumers to benefit from making intelligent, informed decisions about dietary supplements they want to use for their health and well-being. We want the same objective for kratom. The FDA is not going to come to that conclusion on their own. We know that they have this longstanding bias, but we can help if we are committed to the process that assures that we are going to be FDA compliant with those botanical product standards that are appropriately applied to kratom. So please, let's all work together. See this great news that's coming out of Indonesia, the great progress that we're making. Don't listen to the naysayers. Don't listen to the critics that want to use disinformation to try to mislead you in order to support their own self-serving agendas, which is to have an unregulated marketplace that dooms us to failure. I appreciate, and I know that we at the American Kratom Association are grateful for the cooperation that we received here in Indonesia from high-ranking government officials. We are grateful for the farmers who are committed to follow the processes that are necessary. We hope and we appreciate all of the American consumers who understand this process and are willing to stand with us in order to protect this marketplace. Greatly encouraged, great news out of Indonesia. When we get back this week, we're going to have some further debriefs and we'll get together for a webinar to discuss this. But in the meantime, I wanted to share this great news of the progress that we're making. And when I get back to the United States, as I say, we'll have further discussions. Thanks to everyone.